The first thing Captain Sarah Chen noticed about the Zelkari trade station wasn't the impressive crystalline architecture or the bustling alien marketplace. It was the sound of something small whimpering in pain. She paused at the entrance to Docking Bay 7, her weathered hand instinctively moving to the plasma pistol at her hip. 20 years of running freight between human colonies and alien worlds had taught her to trust her instincts. And right now those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. The whimpering came again, weaker this time. "Captain?" Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez stepped up beside her, his dark eyes scanning the seemingly empty bay. "The Zelkari dockmaster said Bay 7 would be clear for our cargo transfer." Sarah held up a hand for silence, tilting her head to listen. There, behind a stack of cargo containers marked with Zelkari symbols she couldn't read, something was definitely there. And it was hurt. "Stay alert, Marcus." Sarah drew her sidearm and approached the containers slowly. Zelkari aren't exactly known for their honesty in trade deals, but as they rounded the corner of the metallic blue containers, what they found wasn't a Zelkari ambush or some alien predator. It was something that made Sarah's heart clench with unexpected emotion. Curled up against the cold deck plating was a creature about the size of a large dog, but unlike anything in Earth's animal kingdom, its fur was a deep violet color that seemed to shimmer in the station's artificial light. And it had 6 legs ending in delicate paws with what looked like tiny fingers. 2 large, golden eyes dominated its feline-like face, and those eyes were filled with unmistakable pain and fear. But what really caught Sarah's attention were the wounds. Deep gashes along the creature's flanks that had been crudely sealed with some kind of biofoam. And what looked like burn marks along its back legs. Someone had hurt this animal badly, then left it here to die. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, lowering his weapon. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, holstering her pistol and slowly crouching down. "But it's hurt. And it's scared." The creature Sarah found herself thinking of it as he somehow lifted his head weakly as she approached. Those golden eyes fixed on her face, and Sarah felt something twist in her chest. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of injured soldiers during the Centauri conflicts. It was the look of someone who had given up hope. "Hey there, little guy," she said softly, extending her hand palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and his ears, pointed and mobile like a cat's but larger, swiveled toward her voice. For a moment, Sarah thought he might try to run. Instead, he did something that completely caught her off guard. He spoke. The voice was weak and somewhat higher pitched than a human's, but the words were clear and unmistakably in standard galactic common. "Please. No more pain." Marcus took a step back in shock. "Captain. It's sentient. I can see that," Sarah replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. Sentient beings weren't pets. They were people. And someone had tortured a person and left him here to die. She moved closer, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "What's your name?" The creature's golden eyes blinked slowly. "Keth. My name was Keth." "Was?" Sarah frowned. "What do you mean, was?" Keth's head dropped back to the deck plating, exhaustion evident in every line of his small body. Masters said, "No longer worthy of name. Just pet. Failed. Pet." The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind, and she felt a cold fury building in her gut. The Zelkari were known throughout the galaxy for their practice of keeping exotic pets, sentient beings from less technologically advanced species, that they treated as playthings and status symbols. It was technically legal under Galactic Council law, as long as the pets came from pre-spaceflight civilizations and were treated humanely. But there was nothing humane about what had been done to Keth. "Marcus," she said without looking back, "get the medkit from the ship. The good one, with the universal trauma foam." "Captain, I don't think we should." "That's an order, Lieutenant." She heard his footsteps retreating and turned her attention back to Keth. The small being was shivering. Whether from cold or shock, she couldn't tell. Probably both. "Keth," she said gently, I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the human freighter Wanderer. Can you tell me what happened to you? For a moment, she didn't think he would answer. Then, slowly, as if each word was being dragged out of him, Keth began to speak. Masters bought me from traders when I was small. Very small. My people. We were peaceful. Farmers. Crafters. When the starships came, we thought they were gods. Sarah's jaw clenched. She'd heard stories like this before. Species just beginning to develop agriculture being contacted by unscrupulous alien traders who convinced them that their technology made them divine. It was supposed to be against Galactic Council regulations, but enforcement was spotty at best. The traders said I was special. Quick to learn. Masters paid much for me. Keth's voice grew even weaker. Trained me to perform tricks, dances, speaking different languages. Was good pet for many cycles. What changed? Sarah asked, though she had a sinking feeling she knew where this story was heading. Grew larger, less cute. Masters bought new pet, younger one. From my own people. Keth's eyes filled with something that looked heartbreakingly like tears. Little sister. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. They bought your sister? Masters said. Said old pets must make room for new ones. If I could not earn keep then. Keth gestured weakly at his wounds. Punishment collar. Shock treatments. When I tried to protect little sister from their games, they did this. He shifted slightly, and Sarah could see more injuries. Burns that looked like they came from some kind of energy weapon, and what appeared to be bite marks from much larger teeth. These people hadn't just abandoned Keth, they'd tortured him. Where is your sister now? Sarah asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Sold to new masters. Heard them talking. Wanted younger pet for their friends to enjoy. The way Keth said the word, enjoy, made Sarah's stomach turn. I tried to stop them. Failed to protect her. Marcus returned with the medical kit, his face grim. He'd been with Sarah long enough to read her moods, and right now, she was radiating barely controlled rage. Captain, he said quietly as he set down the kit. The dockmaster is asking about our cargo transfer timeline. Tell the dockmaster he can wait, Sarah replied, opening the medical kit and pulling out a bioscanner. We have more important things to deal with right now. She ran the scanner over Keth's injuries, trying to keep her expression neutral as the readings came back. 3 broken ribs, severe tissue damage along his flanks, burns consistent with energy weapon fire, and signs of long-term malnutrition and stress. Whoever had done this to him had been systematic about it. The trauma foam should help with the immediate damage, she told Keth, as she began applying the healing gel to his wounds. But you're going to need proper medical treatment. No. Why? Keth asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. Why? Help failed pet. I am worthless now. Sarah paused in her treatment, looking directly into those golden eyes. Because you're not a pet, Keth. You're a person. And no person deserves to be treated like this. But Galactic Council law says the Galactic Council can go to hell, Sarah said firmly. As far as I'm concerned, anyone intelligent enough to hold a conversation is intelligent enough to deserve basic rights. She continued applying the trauma foam, noting how Keth's shivering gradually subsided as the healing gel began its work. The biofoam would accelerate his natural healing processes and provide pain relief, but it would take time for the worst of the damage to repair itself. Captain, Marcus said quietly, we should probably discuss this privately. Sarah glanced up at him. She could see the conflict in his face. Marcus was a good man, but he was also practical. Getting involved in Galactic Council politics wasn't exactly part of their freight-running mission profile. In a minute, she told him, then looked back at Keth. I'm going to need to get you to our ship's medical bay. Can you walk? Keth struggled to lift himself up on his 6 legs, but managed to stand with obvious effort. Yes. Can walk. Good. Marcus, help me get him aboard. Slowly. As they made their way across the docking bay toward the Wanderer, Sarah's mind was racing. She couldn't just patch Keth up and drop him off at the nearest planet, not in his condition, and certainly not without knowing he'd be safe. But harboring what the Galactic Council considered stolen property could get her ship impounded and her crew arrested. The Wanderer wasn't much to look at from the outside, a battered Hermes-class freighter that had seen better decades. But she was home, and Sarah had spent years modifying her systems to run faster and more efficiently than her original specs suggested. Right now, those modifications might be the difference between freedom and a Galactic Council prison cell. They helped Keth into the ship's small but well-equipped medical bay, and Sarah began connecting him to the more advanced diagnostic equipment. The readings were even worse than her initial scan had suggested. Whoever did this to him, Marcus observed. They weren't just being cruel. This level of systematic injury, it's like they were trying to break his will. Probably were, Sarah replied grimly. Some people get off on having complete power over another being. She programmed the medical computer to begin a full treatment cycle, including tissue regeneration and psychological trauma protocols. It would take several days for Keth to recover physically, and probably much longer for the emotional wounds to heal. Captain, Marcus said carefully, we need to talk about what we're doing here. Sarah looked at Keth, who had fallen asleep on the medical bay's treatment table. Even unconscious, his face showed lines of pain and stress that no being should have to carry. What we're doing, she said quietly, is the right thing. The right thing might get us all killed, Marcus pointed out. Or worse, imprisoned. The Zelkari don't take kindly to humans interfering with their property laws. Then we make sure they don't find out. Marcus stared at her. Sarah, you can't be serious. We can't just steal someone's property and... He's not property, Sarah snapped. Her voice louder than she'd intended. She took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. Marcus, that being in there is intelligent, articulate, and capable of making his own decisions. The only reason he's considered property is because his people don't have starships. I'm not arguing the morality of it, Marcus said. I'm arguing the practicality. We're already flying close to the edge with some of our cargo runs. Add harboring stolen property to that, and we'll have every law enforcement agency in 3 sectors looking for us. Sarah walked over to the medical bay's viewport and looked out at the Zelkari station. Somewhere out there, Keth's sister was probably being subjected to the same kind of treatment. Or worse, how many other sentient beings were being bought and sold like livestock while the Galactic Council turned a blind eye? 20 years ago, she said finally, I swore an oath as an officer in the Terran Space Navy to protect and defend the innocent, regardless of species or origin. You're not in the Navy anymore, Sarah. No. But I'm still human. And humans don't abandon people who need help. She turned back to face Marcus, and he could see the determination in her eyes. He'd seen that look before, usually right before Sarah did something that was simultaneously heroic and completely insane. So, what's the plan? He asked, resignation clear in his voice. First, we get Keth healthy. Then we find out where they took his sister. And then... Sarah's expression hardened. Then... we go get her. That's not a plan. That's a suicide mission. Maybe. But it's the right thing to do. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then sighed. You know I'm with you, right? Even when you're being completely crazy? Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd found Keth. I was counting on it. Over the next several hours, as the Wanderer departed Zelkari space and headed toward the outer rim, Sarah found herself spending more and more time in the medical bay. Keth slept most of the time, his body working to heal itself with the help of the ship's advanced medical systems. But during his brief periods of consciousness, he proved to be surprisingly articulate and intelligent. Your people, Sarah asked during one of these conversations. What are they like? Keth's ears perked up slightly at the question. Peaceful. We call ourselves the Venth. We live in harmony with our world, taking only what we need and giving back what we can. Sounds like a good way to live. It was. Keth's voice grew sad. before the star people came. They brought gifts, metal tools, healing medicines, lights that never went dark. Said they were emissaries of the gods, come to bring us wisdom. And in return? In return, they wanted only small payment. A few of our children, they said, the brightest and most promising. To serve the gods in the sky. Keth's golden eyes fixed on Sarah's face. My parents were honored to give me to the gods. They thought I would live in paradise. Sarah felt sick. It was an old story, played out on dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy. Technologically advanced species, taking advantage of less developed ones, using their superior technology to pose as deities or benevolent benefactors. The practice was technically illegal under current Galactic Council law, but enforcement was nearly impossible across such a vast area of space. How long were you with the Zelkari? She asked. 15 cycles of my world's star. In human terms. Keth paused, apparently doing some mental calculation. Approximately 12 of your years. 12 years. Keth had been taken from his family as a child and spent more than a decade as a pet, performing tricks for the entertainment of beings who saw him as property rather than a person. And now his sister was going through the same thing. Keth, Sarah said carefully. Do you know which family bought your sister? His ears flattened against his head. Heard names. Veltar family. Very wealthy. Very powerful. They own many ships. Many worlds. They collect rare pets. Sarah made a mental note to look up the Veltar family in the ship's databases. If they were as wealthy and powerful as Keth suggested, rescuing his sister wasn't going to be easy. But Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially when innocent lives were at stake. What's your sister's name? She asked. Zira. She is. Was only 8 cycles when they took her. So young. So trusting. Keth's voice broke slightly. She looked up to me, thought her big brother could protect her from anything. You tried to protect her. Tried and failed. When they brought her to the same house as me, I was so happy. Thought maybe we could comfort each other, make the best of our situation. But when I saw what they planned to do to her, Keth shuddered. I could not stand by and watch. What did you do? Attacked one of the masters when he tried to. When he put his hands on her. Keth's voice grew steady, despite the obvious pain the memory caused. Bit him badly, drew blood. That explained the severity of his injuries, Sarah realized. In Zelkari culture, a pet that attacked its master was considered dangerous and usually destroyed immediately. The fact that Keth was still alive suggested they'd decided to make an example of him instead. They used pain collar on me for 3 days, Keth continued, shock after shock, until I could barely move. Then they brought in discipline specialists, beings who know how to cause maximum pain without killing. They made Zira watch. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. They tortured you in front of your sister? Said it was lesson. Show her what happens to pets who forget their place. She cried the whole time, begged them to stop. That almost hurt worse than the pain. And then they sold her? Next day, said she needed different training, away from bad influence of rebellious brother. Heard them talking to Veltar representative. They wanted young pet for their son. Someone to break in properly. The way Keth said those last words made Sarah's blood run cold. She had a pretty good idea what breaking in meant in this context, and it made her more determined than ever to find Zira. Keth, she said, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to get your sister back. He looked at her with those large golden eyes, and she could see hope warring with despair in his expression. Why? You barely know us. We are nothing to you. You're sentient beings in distress, Sarah replied simply. That makes you everything to me. The medical bay's door chimed, and Marcus entered carrying a datapad. His expression was grim. I ran a search on the Veltar family, he announced. The good news is, I found them. The bad news is, you're not going to like what I found. Sarah took the datapad and scrolled through the information Marcus had compiled. The Veltar were indeed wealthy and powerful, one of the oldest and most influential families in Zelkari space. They owned a dozen worlds, controlled several major shipping lanes, and had extensive political connections throughout the Galactic Council. But that wasn't the worst part. They're based on Veltar Prime, Marcus said. A heavily fortified world in the heart of Zelkari space. Multiple orbital defense platforms, a standing fleet of warships, and a planetary shield that could stop a supernova. Sarah continued reading. The Veltar family compound was described as a fortress palace, surrounded by energy barriers and protected by some of the most advanced security systems money could buy. Getting in would be difficult. Getting out alive would be nearly impossible. Their son, Sarah read aloud. Corvel Veltar, 23 years old, heir to the family fortune, and known for his collection of exotic pets. She looked up the personal information on Corvel and felt her stomach turn. Multiple accusations of abuse that had been quietly settled out of court. Reports of pets going missing or being found dead under suspicious circumstances, and photos from society events showing him with various sentient beings wearing elaborate collars and vacant expressions. He's a monster, she said quietly. A well-connected monster with an army protecting him, Marcus pointed out. Sarah, I know what you're thinking, but this isn't like our usual jobs. We can't just sneak in and sneak out. This would be a full-scale assault on one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. Sarah set down the datapad and looked through the medical bay's viewport at Keth, who was pretending to sleep but obviously listening to their conversation. Then we'd better start planning carefully, she said. Marcus stared at her. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Do you have any idea what we'd need to pull off something like this? The equipment, the manpower, the resources. Sarah walked over to the ship's communication console and began entering a series of codes. Maybe, but first, I need to make some calls. Who are you calling? Sarah's fingers moved across the console as she activated the ship's long-range communication array. Some old friends who might be interested in a good cause. The first call went to Commander Lisa Park, Sarah's former executive officer during the Centauri conflicts. Lisa now ran a private security firm that specialized in difficult extractions throughout the Outer Rim. If anyone could help them get past Veltar Prime's defenses, it would be her. The second call was to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a xenobiologist who had spent years studying the effects of psychological trauma on non-human species. If they managed to rescue Zira, she would need someone who understood how to help her recover from whatever she'd been through. The third call was the most important, and the most dangerous. Sarah activated a heavily encrypted channel and waited for a response from deep space. This is Nightfall Station, came a gravelly voice over the comm. State your business. This is Captain Sarah Chen. Registration Tango 77 Alpha. I need to speak with Alexei. There was a pause, then the voice returned. Stand by. Marcus looked alarmed. Sarah, you didn't call. The Reapers, Sarah finished. Yes, I did. The Reapers were, technically speaking, pirates. But they were pirates with a code. They only targeted slavers, illegal weapons dealers, and others who preyed on the innocent. They were also some of the most skilled ship-to-ship combat specialists in known space, and their leader, Alexei Petrov, owed Sarah a favor. Little Sarah, came a booming voice over the comm. Is that really you, or has someone stolen your ship? Hello, Alexei. I need your help. Of course you do. No one calls the Reapers for social chat. What kind of help? Sarah took a deep breath. The kind that involves rescuing innocents from some very bad people. The kind that might get us all killed. And there was a moment of silence. Then Alexei's laughter filled the medical bay. You know just what to say to get old pirates' attention. Tell me more. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined the situation to Alexei, Lisa, and Elena. She explained about finding Keth, learning about his sister's fate, and the seemingly impossible task of rescuing her from the Veltar family compound. The responses were mixed. Lisa was intrigued by the challenge but concerned about the risks. Sarah, I've run ops against some tough targets, but the Veltar compound is in a different league entirely. We'd need inside intelligence, perfect timing, and a lot of luck. Elena was more supportive. From what you've described, both Keth and his sister will need extensive psychological rehabilitation. The trauma from years of abuse doesn't just go away. Especially for non-human species whose emotional development may be very different from ours. Alexei was, predictably, enthusiastic. Veltar scum have been preying on innocent species for too long. About time someone taught them lesson. When do we start? Well, we need more information first, Sarah said. Ship schedules, security rotations, floor plans of the compound. And we need to know exactly where they're keeping Zira. I might be able to help with that, came a weak voice from the medical bed. Everyone turned to look at Keth, who was struggling to sit up despite the medical restraints. I lived in Veltar compound for 3 days before they sold Zira, he explained. Saw layout, heard guards talking. If you have star charts, I can show you weak points. Sarah looked at Marcus, who shrugged. Well, we've already committed to doing something completely insane. Might as well get expert advice. As the planning session continued into the night, Sarah found herself thinking about what they were really attempting. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a declaration of war against an entire system of legalized slavery and abuse. Win or lose, they would be making a statement that some things were more important than political convenience or legal technicalities. But as she watched Keth struggling to contribute despite his injuries, determined to help save the sister he'd failed to protect, Sarah knew they were making the right choice. Sometimes being human meant taking risks for people who couldn't take them for themselves. Sometimes it meant standing up to bullies, even when those bullies had armies and wealth beyond imagination. And sometimes it meant being willing to fight against impossible odds, because the alternative was letting innocent people suffer. Sarah Chen had spent 20 years fighting for causes both large and small. But this time, she wasn't fighting for a government, or a political ideal, or a strategic advantage. This time, she was fighting for the simple principle that every sentient being deserved to be free, and she was going to win, or die trying. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the cargo bay of Nightfall Station, watching as the most unlikely rescue team in galactic history prepared for what could only be described as a suicide mission. Alexei's pirates looked exactly like what they were: hardened fighters who had spent years battling the worst scum the galaxy had to offer. They moved with deadly efficiency as they checked their weapons and equipment, their faces bearing the scars and weathered features of people who had seen too much violence and death. Lisa's security specialists, by contrast, looked like corporate executives, clean-cut, professional, and utterly unremarkable. Which was exactly the point. Their job was to infiltrate and gather intelligence, not fight pitched battles. Dr. Elena Vasquez looked completely out of place among the warriors and spies, but her presence was just as crucial as anyone else's. She had spent the last 3 weeks developing treatment protocols for Zelkari psychological conditioning, using Keth as both patient and consultant, and Keth himself had become an integral part of the planning process. Despite Sarah's concerns about his physical and emotional state, he had insisted on participating in the mission. His knowledge of Veltar compound's layout and security procedures had proven invaluable. The mansion has 17 levels above ground and 5 below, Keth explained, using a holographic projector to display the compound's structure. Family quarters are on the top 5 levels. Guest quarters and entertainment areas occupy the middle levels. Service areas, kitchens, and staff quarters are on the lower levels. Where would they be keeping your sister? Lisa asked, studying the hologram intently. Keth's ears drooped. Probably the private quarters. Master Corval likes to keep his special pets close to him. The way he said, "special pets," made everyone in the room uncomfortable. They all knew what it implied, and none of them wanted to think too hard about what Zira might be going through. Security checkpoints? Alexei inquired, his Russian accent making the words sound like a threat. Here, here, and here. Keth indicated points on the hologram. Plus roving patrols on all levels. Guards are well-trained and heavily armed, but they are not expecting attack from within, meaning servants and pets move freely through most areas. Guards barely notice them. Sarah studied the holographic layout, her mind working through the various possibilities. A direct assault was out of the question. The compound's defenses were simply too strong. But infiltration might work if they could get inside without raising alarms. The service entrance, she said, pointing to a location on the hologram's ground level. Supply ships dock there regularly? Every few days, Keth confirmed. Food, luxury items, replacement equipment. All inspected, but not thoroughly. And the servants? Mostly humans, actually. Veltar family prefers human staff for their efficiency and discretion. Sarah glanced at Lisa, who nodded. I can work with that. Get me inside as part of a service crew, and I can map the interior defenses. What about the orbital defenses? Marcus asked. Even if we get Zira out of the compound, we still have to escape the planet. Alexei grinned, and the expression was not pleasant. Leave orbital defenses to me and my boys. We may not be able to destroy them all, but we can certainly provide adequate distraction. How adequate? The kind that makes defense platform operators worry more about their own survival than stopping small ship leaving planet. Dr. Vasquez looked concerned. Are we talking about actual warfare here? Because if we're planning to attack military installations, we are talking about creating confusion and panic, Alexei interrupted. Reapers do not target civilians or defensive installations without provocation. But if those installations happen to receive false sensor readings indicating massive incoming invasion force, Sarah understood. The Reapers were experts at electronic warfare and psychological manipulation. They could make a handful of ships look like an entire fleet on enemy sensors, at least long enough to create the chaos they needed. Timeline? She asked. Lisa consulted her data pad. I need 48 hours to get into position and map the internal security. The service ship I'll be using arrives day after tomorrow. Keth, Sarah said, are you absolutely sure about this? Once we start, there's no turning back. The small alien looked up at her with those large golden eyes, and for a moment Sarah was reminded of how fragile he really was. The medical treatments had healed most of his physical injuries, but the emotional scars were still clearly visible. Captain Chen, he said quietly, I have spent 3 weeks on your ship, being treated with kindness and respect. For the first time in 12 years, I have been seen as a person, rather than property. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever. What's that? Hope. And now you offer me chance to give same gift to my sister. How could I refuse? Sarah nodded, understanding completely. This wasn't just about rescuing one person anymore. It was about proving that the galaxy's most vulnerable people didn't have to face their tormentors alone. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Sarah spent most of her time reviewing intelligence reports and contingency plans, trying to anticipate every possible thing that could go wrong. The list was depressingly long. Marcus focused on preparing the Wanderer for a very fast escape, upgrading the ship's engines and defensive systems with equipment provided by the Reapers. Their old freighter would never be a match for military vessels, but she might be able to outrun pursuit long enough to reach safe harbor. Dr. Vasquez worked with Keth on developing protocols for handling Zira once they found her. Years of conditioning and abuse would have left the young Vent in a very fragile psychological state, and they needed to be prepared for anything from catatonic withdrawal to violent panic attacks. And throughout it all, Sarah found herself thinking about the larger implications of what they were doing. The Veltar family was powerful enough to demand retribution from the Galactic Council. Even if the rescue succeeded, there would be consequences that extended far beyond their small team. But every time those doubts crept in, she would see Keth working tirelessly to help save his sister, or catch a glimpse of the old scars that still marked his violet fur, and her resolve would harden once again. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. On the morning of the operation, Sarah gathered her team in the Wanderer's common area for a final briefing. The atmosphere was tense, but not with fear. These were all experienced professionals who understood the risks and had accepted them. Lisa goes in first, Sarah began. She'll have 6 hours to map the compound's internal security and locate Zira. Once we have confirmed location and defenses, Alexei's people create distraction in orbit. How big distraction? Alexei asked with a predatory grin. Big enough to draw security forces away from compound, not big enough to trigger planetary bombardment protocols. We want confusion, not annihilation. Understood. We make much noise, cause many headaches for defense commanders, but no permanent damage unless they escalate first. Sarah nodded and turned to the others. Once orbital defenses are distracted, Marcus lands the Wanderer at the service entrance. Keth and I go in, locate Zira, and extract her as quickly as possible. What if she doesn't want to come? Dr. Vasquez asked. Years of conditioning might have left her psychologically dependent on her captors. It's not uncommon in severe abuse cases. Then we make it clear she has a choice, Sarah replied. But we don't leave without giving her that choice. The plan was simple enough in concept. But Sarah knew that no plan survived contact with reality. Once they were inside the compound, they would have to adapt to whatever they found. One more thing, she added. If this goes bad, if we're captured or killed, no one tries to rescue us. Everyone scatters and disappears. Understood? There was a chorus of agreement, though Sarah could see in their faces that none of them had any intention of abandoning the others if things went wrong. It was both comforting and terrifying. 6 hours later, Lisa's voice crackled over the comm system. I'm in. Security is tight but predictable. Zira's location confirmed private quarters on the 15th level. Condition? Sarah asked. There was a pause that lasted too long. Alive, but another pause. Sarah, when you find her, be prepared. She's not in good shape. Sarah felt her jaw clench. Understood. Alexei, you're up. With pleasure, came the Russian's voice. Beginning approach to outer defense perimeter. In 3, 2, 1. Mark. On the Wanderer's main display, Sarah could see the sensor readings from Veltar Prime's orbital stations. Everything looked normal for about 30 seconds. Then the screens erupted in chaos as multiple contact alerts began sounding simultaneously. Veltar Defense Command. This is Admiral Morrison of the Terran Third Fleet. Alexei's voice boomed over all communication channels, disguised by voice modulation software. You are harboring war criminals. Surrender immediately or face the consequences. Sarah had to admire the audacity of it. The Terran Third Fleet was currently stationed on the other side of the galaxy, but most Zelkari commanders wouldn't know that. All they would see on their sensors was what appeared to be a massive human battle group dropping out of hyperspace. Orbital defenses are scrambling, Marcus reported from the pilot's seat. All available ships moving to intercept presumed invasion force. Time to go, Sarah said, checking her equipment one final time. She wore the simple gray uniform of a service worker, with her weapons concealed in a maintenance toolkit. Keth was dressed similarly, though his alien appearance would require some explanation if they were challenged. The Wanderer descended through Veltar Prime's atmosphere, just another small cargo ship heading for the service docks. The planet's surface was a study in contrasts, gleaming cities surrounded by carefully manicured wilderness areas, where the wealthy could enjoy nature without actually having to rough it. The Veltar compound sat on a hill overlooking the planetary capital, its crystalline spires reaching toward the sky like a monument to arrogance and power. Sarah could see the energy barriers surrounding it, shimmering in the afternoon sunlight like a heat mirage. Nice place, Marcus observed. Shame if something were to happen to it. Remember, Sarah warned him, we're not here to destroy property. We're here to save a person. I know, but I can still appreciate the irony. The service docks were exactly as Keth had described, a utilitarian area designed for efficiency rather than appearance. Ships came and went regularly, carrying everything needed to maintain the lifestyle of one of the galaxy's wealthiest families. The Wanderer settled onto a designated landing pad, and Sarah took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. Once they left the ship, they would be committed to seeing this through to whatever end awaited them. Stay close, she told Keth as they made their way toward the service entrance. If anyone challenges us, let me do the talking. The service entrance was guarded by two bored-looking Zelkari security guards who barely glanced at their identification cards. Sarah had been counting on the natural arrogance of the wealthy servants and maintenance workers were beneath notice, essentially invisible to people who had never had to work for a living. Replacement parts for the environmental systems, Sarah announced. indicating the toolkit she carried. One of the guards waved them through without even looking up from his entertainment display. Level 7. Section 12. Try not to break anything. We'll be careful, Sarah replied, and meant it in a completely different way than the guard would understand. The interior of the compound was even more opulent than Sarah had expected. Crystalline walls displayed constantly shifting patterns of light and color, while hovering sculptures provided elegant ambiance. Everything was designed to impress visitors with the family's wealth and power. But Sarah wasn't impressed. She was disgusted. All this luxury had been built on the suffering of people like Keth and Zira. Innocent beings who had been bought and sold like decorative objects. They made their way through the service corridors, following the route Lisa had mapped out for them. The service areas were much more utilitarian than the public spaces. But even here, everything was kept immaculately clean and organized. This way, Keth whispered, indicating a maintenance lift that would take them up to the residential levels. Lisa said guards on level 15 are changed every 4 hours. We have maybe 30 minutes before next rotation. The lift carried them smoothly upward, past levels filled with guest quarters, entertainment areas, and conference rooms. Sarah could hear voices and laughter from some of the rooms they passed, the sounds of people enjoying themselves while remaining completely oblivious to the suffering taking place just floors above them. Level 15 was different. The moment they stepped out of the lift, Sarah could feel the oppressive atmosphere. The walls here were lined with what looked like viewing windows, behind which she could see various alien beings in elaborate enclosures. A zoo for sentient species. "This is sick," she muttered, trying not to look too closely at the displays. "Gets worse," Keth replied quietly. "Special collection is at end of hall." They moved through the corridors as quickly as they dared, past displays that made Sarah's stomach churn. Each enclosure contained a different species, all of them clearly intelligent, all of them trapped behind energy barriers that turned them into living exhibits. At the end of the hall was a set of double doors marked with Zelkari symbols Sarah couldn't read. But she didn't need to read them to know what lay beyond. The psychic weight of suffering was almost palpable. "Private collection," Keth explained, his voice barely a whisper. "Where he keeps favorites." Sarah used Lisa's security codes to unlock the doors, and immediately wished she hadn't. The room beyond was designed like a luxurious bedroom, but with additions that made its true purpose clear. Restraints, monitoring equipment, and worse things that Sarah didn't want to think about. And in the center of it all, curled up on an oversized cushion like a pet, was a small figure with violet fur. "Zira," Keth breathed, and started forward before Sarah could stop him. The young Venth raised her head at the sound of her name, and Sarah's heart broke at what she saw. The same large golden eyes as her brother, but empty of hope or recognition. The same delicate features, but marked with scars that spoke of unspeakable cruelty. "Zira?" Keth approached slowly, his voice gentle. "Little sister, it's me. It's Keth." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, recognition dawned in those golden eyes, followed immediately by terror. "No," Zira whispered, pressing herself back against the cushions. "No. You are not real. He said you were dead. Said if I was good, if I did everything he wanted, he would not hurt you anymore." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. The psychological conditioning was even worse than they had feared. Zira had been taught to believe that her cooperation was the only thing keeping her brother alive. "I am real," Keth said softly, extending his hand toward her. "And I am here to take you home." "Home?" Zira's voice was barely audible. "There is no home. Only here. Only Master," he said. "He said, if I ever tried to leave, he would find you and make you suffer." Sarah stepped forward carefully, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "Zira, I'm Captain Sarah Chen. I'm a human, and I'm here to help. Your brother is alive and free, and we want to take you somewhere safe." "Humans lie," Zira replied. But there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Master said humans are cruel. Said they would hurt me worse than he does. Some humans are cruel, Sarah admitted. Just like some Zelkari are cruel. But some of us try to help people who need it. She sat down on the floor, making herself less threatening. Zira, I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt badly, but you have a choice now. You can come with us, or you can stay here. Either way, your brother will be safe. You would leave me if I chose to stay? If that's what you really wanted, yes. But I don't think it is what you want. I think you want to be free. Zira looked back and forth between Sarah and Keth, confusion and hope warring in her expression. No more being owned by anyone, Sarah confirmed. Free means making your own choices about your life. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the distant sounds of the compound around them. Then, slowly, Zira reached out and touched her brother's outstretched hand. I want to go home, she whispered. Then let's go, Sarah said, rising to her feet. But we need to move quickly. Getting Zira out of her quarters proved easier than expected. Years of conditioning had taught her to move quietly and obey without question. But as they made their way back toward the service lift, Sarah could see the young Venth struggling with each step. It hurts, Zira whispered to Keth. He said leaving would hurt. He said the pain would follow me wherever I went. That is lie he told to keep you trapped, Keth replied gently. Pain will get better with time. Freedom will help you heal. They had almost reached the lift when the alarms began sounding. Security breach on level 15, came an announcement over the compound's communication system. All units respond immediately. Sarah cursed under her breath. Someone had discovered Zira's absence sooner than expected. Their careful infiltration was about to become a running gunfight. This way, she said, abandoning stealth for speed. They needed to reach the service entrance before the guards could seal off the building. Behind them, she could hear the sound of running feet and shouted orders. The Veltar family security forces were well-trained and equipped, and they wouldn't hesitate to use lethal force to protect their employer's property. The service lift seemed to take forever to arrive, and even longer to descend to the ground level. Sarah could hear the pursuit getting closer with each passing second. Sarah, what's your status? Lisa's voice came over her concealed communicator. Package acquired. But we've been made, Sarah replied. Need immediate extraction. On it. Marcus is already warming up the engines. They reached the service level just as the lift doors opened to reveal 2 security guards waiting for them. Sarah's combat training took over, and she dropped both guards with precise stunner blasts before they could raise their weapons. Move, she shouted, dragging Zira along as Keth provided cover. The service corridors had become a maze of chaos as alarms continued to sound and automated security systems activated. Energy barriers began dropping across intersections, trying to seal off escape routes, but Lisa had done her job well. She had mapped every security checkpoint and identified backup routes that the automated systems didn't cover. Sarah followed her directions, leading them through maintenance passages and emergency exits that the compound's designers had never intended for this purpose. They burst through the service entrance to find Marcus already lifting the Wanderer off its landing pad. The ship's cargo bay doors were open, and its defensive guns were tracking multiple targets. Go, go, go! Marcus shouted over the ship's external speakers. Sarah practically threw Zira into the cargo bay, with Keth close behind. She rolled through the doors just as Marcus engaged the engines and sent the Wanderer rocketing toward the sky. Behind them, the compound's defensive systems were finally coming online. Energy beams lanced through the atmosphere, where they had been just seconds before. Orbital defenses are still distracted, Marcus reported. But that won't last long. We need to clear the atmosphere before they figure out what's happening. On the main display, Sarah could see the chaos Alexi's ships were causing in orbit. Veltar Defense Command was scrambling every available vessel to respond to what they thought was a massive invasion force. But experienced commanders would soon realize they were being deceived. Alexei, Sarah called over the comm. We're out. Time to disappear. Already on it, came the Russian's cheerful reply. Veltar scum are very confused right now. Perfect time for dramatic exit. The false fleet contacts began vanishing from the orbital sensors as the Reaper ships activated their stealth systems and faded into the background noise of space. Within minutes, the elaborate deception had dissolved, leaving the Veltar defense forces with nothing to shoot at except empty space. But by then, the Wanderer was already approaching the edge of the system's gravity well, ready to jump to hyperspace. "Sarah," Dr. Vasquez called from the medical bay, "I need to examine Zira as soon as we're safely away. The psychological trauma indicators I'm seeing are severe." Sarah looked back at the young Venth, who was huddled against her brother in the cargo bay. Even free from her captors, Zira looked lost and terrified. The healing process would be long and difficult, but she was alive, and she was free, and that was what mattered. "Marcus," Sarah said, "set course for Haven Station." Maximum speed. Haven Station was a remote outpost in the neutral zone, far from Galactic Council jurisdiction and Veltar influence. It would be a safe place for Zira to begin recovering from her ordeal. As the stars stretched into lines around them and the Wanderer entered hyperspace, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had done something impossible, rescued an innocent person from one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. But as she looked at Keth and Zira, she realized this was only the beginning. There were millions of other sentient beings suffering under the galaxy's legal slavery systems. Millions of people who needed someone to stand up for them. And maybe, just maybe, they had started something that would grow into something larger. A movement of people who refused to accept that intelligence and technology gave anyone the right to own another sentient being. For the first time in years, Captain Sarah Chen allowed herself to hope that the galaxy might actually become a better place. But first, they had to make sure Zira survived the journey ahead. Freedom was just the first step on a very long road to healing. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of Haven Station, watching ships arrive and depart through the massive docking bays that extended from the station's central hub. What had started as a simple rescue mission had evolved into something much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The station bustled with activity as beings from dozens of species went about their daily business. But these weren't tourists or traders, these were refugees, survivors, and the growing network of people who had dedicated their lives to fighting the galaxy's hidden slave trade. "Captain?" came a familiar voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Zira approaching, her violet fur now glossy and healthy, her golden eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. The transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable, though Sarah knew the young Venth still carried emotional scars that might never fully heal. "How are the new arrivals settling in?" Sarah asked. "Better than expected," Zira replied, her common galactic much improved since her rescue. "The Korathi children are responding well to the therapy protocols Dr. Vasquez developed, and the Thirani adult seems to be recovering his memory." Sarah nodded, pleased but not surprised. Dr. Vasquez had become something of a legend among trauma specialists, pioneering treatment methods for the unique psychological damage inflicted by sentient being trafficking. Her work had attracted volunteers from across the galaxy. "Any word from the Centauri rescue?" Zira's expression grew serious. Lisa's team extracted 12 Venth from a consortium breeding facility. But the facility was destroyed in the process. "The consortium is very angry." That was putting it mildly, Sarah reflected. The Centauri consortium was even more powerful than the Veltar family, and they took attacks on their property very personally. The fact that their property consisted of sentient beings forced into reproductive slavery only made them more dangerous when threatened. "How angry? They've placed a bounty on all of us. 10 million credits for you specifically. 5 million each for Keth, Marcus, and Dr. Vasquez. 3 million for me." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Only 3 million for you? I'm insulted on your behalf." Despite everything she'd been through, Zira managed a small smile. "Keth says I should be grateful not to be worth more to slavers. Keth is wise. Where is your brother? By the way, training the new volunteers in compound infiltration techniques. He's become quite the instructor." Sarah wasn't surprised. Keth had thrown himself into the rescue operations with the dedication of someone who had personally experienced what they were fighting against. His insights into the psychology and methodology of traffickers had proven invaluable in planning missions. "Captain Chen to the command center," came an announcement over the station's communication system. Priority message incoming. Sarah made her way through the station's corridors, noting the subtle but significant changes that had taken place since they'd first arrived. What had begun as a simple refugee facility had evolved into something approaching a small city, complete with schools, workshops, and even cultural centers where different species could maintain their traditions while adapting to freedom. The command center was a bustle of activity as intelligence analysts, mission coordinators, and logistics specialists worked to support rescue operations across 3 sectors. Sarah had never intended to become the leader of an anti-trafficking organization, but circumstances had pushed her into the role. Marcus looked up from a tactical display as she entered. "Sarah, we've got a problem. The Galactic Council is calling for a formal hearing." Sarah's blood ran cold. A formal hearing meant they had moved beyond simple law enforcement interest into the realm of serious political pressure. "What's the charge?" "Violation of interspecies commerce regulations, theft of property, inciting rebellion among primitive species." Marcus's expression was grim. "And terrorism." "Terrorism? They're claiming our rescue operations constitute attacks on legitimate businesses. The Veltar family has been particularly vocal about demanding justice for the unprovoked assault on their compound." Sarah sat down heavily in the command chair. She had known this moment would come eventually. Their operations had become too large and too successful to ignore. The powerful families who profited from the sentient being trade were demanding action. "Do we have any allies in the council?" she asked. "Some. The Terran delegation has been surprisingly supportive, thanks to pressure from human rights groups back on Earth, and several of the newer member species have expressed sympathy for our cause, but not enough to block formal proceedings." "No, not enough for that." Sarah studied the tactical display, noting the positions of various Galactic Council enforcement fleets. If the Council decided to move against Haven Station, they had more than enough firepower to reduce it to scrap metal. "How long do we have?" "The hearing is scheduled for next week. After that." Marcus shrugged. "Depends on the verdict. And our people? The refugees? We're working on evacuation plans. But Sarah, we're talking about thousands of beings. Many of them are still recovering from trauma and won't handle relocation well." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Every decision she made affected the lives of people who had already suffered too much. The thought of abandoning them to save herself was unthinkable. But staying meant potentially condemning them all. "Captain," came another voice from the communications station. "Incoming transmission from the Galactic Council Enforcement Division. They're requesting permission to dock." Sarah's jaw tightened. "How many ships?" 3 cruisers and a dreadnought. Full diplomatic immunity flags. That many ships wasn't a diplomatic mission, it was a show of force designed to intimidate. But Sarah had been intimidated by experts, and she wasn't about to back down now. "Grant them permission. But make it clear that Haven Station operates under neutral zone regulations. Any attempt to seize our people or facilities will be considered an act of war." Over the next few hours, Sarah found herself in a tense standoff with Council Enforcement Admiral Veltaran Kor, a Zelkari, who made no secret of his contempt for human interference in interspecies affairs. "Captain Chen," the Admiral said as they met in one of the station's conference rooms, "you stand accused of serious crimes against the established order. The Council is prepared to be lenient if you cooperate fully with our investigation." "Define cooperation," Sarah replied evenly. "Full disclosure of your organization's membership, financial backing, and operational methods, surrender of all stolen property currently harbored at this station, and cessation of all illegal activities." Sarah looked around the conference room, where several dozen former slaves sat listening to the proceedings. Beings who had been tortured, abused, and treated as property for years, or even decades. The Admiral wanted her to hand them back to their tormentors. "No," she said simply. The Admiral's face darkened. "Captain, you seem to misunderstand the gravity of your situation. The Galactic Council has the authority to—" "The Galactic Council," Sarah interrupted, "has the authority to regulate commerce between its member species. It does not have the authority to condemn sentient beings to slavery simply because they lack interstellar technology. The law is clear. The law is wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the Council representatives looked shocked, that anyone would dare question the fundamental legal framework that governed galactic civilization. Admiral Kor leaned forward across the table. Captain Chen, you are one human, with a handful of supporters facing the combined might of 300 member species. Do you really think you can stand against us? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Admiral, I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while evil flourishes. I've watched civilizations fall because their leaders were too comfortable to fight for what was right. And I've learned that sometimes one person willing to take a stand can change everything. She gestured toward the former slaves in the room. These people were written off as property by your law. But they're not property. They're individuals with thoughts, feelings, dreams, and the right to determine their own fate. Rights are granted by civilization and law. The Admiral replied coldly. These creatures have neither. It was Keth who responded, rising slowly from his seat at the back of the room. Admiral, with respect, you are wrong. The Zelkari officer turned to look at him with barely concealed disgust. A talking pet. How? Quaint. I am not a pet, Keth said quietly. I am a person. I have a name, a family, memories of my world, and my people. I have hopes for the future and grief for what has been lost. These things are not granted by your laws or your civilization. They exist because I exist. He walked forward to stand beside Sarah. For 12 years, beings like you told me I was property. That my thoughts and feelings did not matter because I could not build starships. That my pain was insignificant because my people had not yet reached the stars. The Admiral's expression was one of polite boredom, as if he were listening to a child recite a lesson. But Captain Chen and her people showed me something your laws cannot touch, Keth continued. They showed me that worth is not determined by technology or power. It is determined by the simple fact that we think and feel and choose. Other former slaves were standing now, adding their voices to Keth's words. A Thurani who had spent 8 years as a gladiator in illegal fighting rings. A Korathi female who had been bred like livestock to produce offspring for sale. A Draxian whose artistic abilities had been exploited for the entertainment of wealthy collectors. Each had a story. Each had been told they were property. Each had been rescued by Sarah's growing organization and shown a different way to live. Admiral Kor listened to their testimonies with growing impatience. When the last speaker had finished, he stood and activated a holographic display showing the locations of Council enforcement fleets throughout the sector. Captain Chen, he said, you have 24 hours to surrender your illegal operation and return the stolen property to their rightful owners. If you refuse, the Council will take action to restore order to this region. What kind of action? Sarah asked. Complete blockade of this station. Seizure of all ships and personnel involved in trafficking operations. And if necessary. The Admiral paused dramatically. Orbital bombardment to prevent further violations of galactic law. The threat hung in the air like a poison cloud. Sarah could see fear in the faces of many of the refugees. The prospect of being returned to slavery was almost worse than the threat of death. Admiral, she said carefully, are you really prepared to murder thousands of innocent beings to protect the property rights of slavers? I am prepared to uphold the law, he replied, whatever the cost. After the Council representatives departed, Sarah called an emergency meeting of her senior staff. The conference room was packed with rescue specialists, intelligence analysts, and former slaves who had become key organizers in the growing liberation movement. Options? Sarah asked without preamble. We could scatter, Lisa suggested. Break the organization into smaller cells. Go underground. It would slow our operations, but we could continue rescuing people. And abandon everyone currently at the station? Dr. Vasquez shook her head. Many of our refugees are still too traumatized to handle another displacement. And we'd be condemning them to lives as permanent fugitives. Alexei leaned back in his chair, his scarred face thoughtful. My ships could provide escort for evacuation. Reapers know many hiding places in neutral space, but Admiral is right, Council has much more firepower. What about political pressure? Marcus suggested. We've got supporters on dozens of worlds now. Maybe they could convince their governments to intervene. Not in time, Sarah replied. And political pressure only works if politicians care more about doing the right thing than maintaining profitable relationships. Trapped, Zira had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now she spoke up. There is another option. Everyone turned to look at her. We fight, she said simply. Not with weapons, we cannot win that kind of battle, but with truth. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? The admiral said, rights are granted by civilization and law. But he is wrong. Rights exist because consciousness exists. We do not need anyone's permission to be free. She stood and activated the room's holographic display, showing a map of the galaxy with hundreds of marked systems. In each of these systems, there are beings like us. Slaves, property, pets. They have been told they are worthless, that they exist only to serve others. But what if they knew differently? Understanding began to dawn on Sarah's face. You're talking about a broadcast. Something that reaches every system simultaneously. Yes. A message that tells the truth that every conscious being has the right to be free, regardless of what any law says. That they do not have to accept slavery simply because someone with starships says they must. Dr. Vasquez looked concerned. Zira. The psychological impact of such a message could be enormous. We could trigger uprisings across the galaxy. The casualties would be less than the casualties of doing nothing, Zira replied firmly. Every day, we wait. More of my people and others are captured, tortured, killed. Sometimes the price of freedom is conflict. Sarah studied the galactic map, her mind working through the implications. A coordinated message to every slave world simultaneously would indeed trigger massive uprisings. The established order would fight back viciously, resulting in warfare across multiple sectors. But Zira was right about one thing: the current system was already producing enormous casualties. They were just hidden casualties, suffered by beings whose pain didn't matter to those in power. The technical requirements would be massive, Marcus pointed out. We'd need access to the galaxy's primary communication networks. That means infiltrating council installations across 3 major sectors. My people can handle infiltration, Alexei said. Question is whether we can coordinate timing precisely enough for simultaneous broadcast. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the enormity of what they were discussing. This wasn't just a rescue mission or even a rebellion. It was a revolution that could reshape galactic civilization. If we do this, she said finally, there's no going back. We'll be declaring war on the entire established order. Every government that profits from slavery will be hunting us. Quote, they are already hunting us, Keth pointed out. At least this way, we ensure our message is heard before they silence us. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her team, humans, aliens, former slaves, and former pirates, all united by a common belief that consciousness deserved freedom. They had come together by chance, but they had become something greater than the sum of their parts. All right, she said. Let's do it. The next 18 hours were a frenzy of activity as teams coordinated across multiple sectors to prepare for the most ambitious operation in galactic history. Reaper ships infiltrated Council communication nodes, while intelligence operatives provided real-time updates on security measures. Dr. Vasquez and her team worked frantically to craft a message that would resonate across dozens of different species and cultures. It had to be simple enough to be understood by beings with varying levels of technological sophistication, yet powerful enough to inspire action. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself in the strange position of preparing for what might be her last battle, while simultaneously trying to ensure the survival of thousands of refugees if she didn't survive to protect them. Sarah, Marcus said as they worked through the final preparations. You know this is insane, right? Completely, she agreed. But that doesn't make it wrong. With 6 hours remaining before the Council's ultimatum expired, everything was in place. Reaper infiltration teams were positioned at communication nodes throughout 3 sectors. The message had been translated into 47 languages and encoded for simultaneous transmission. And on Haven Station, Sarah stood before a camera that would broadcast her words to every slave world in the galaxy. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, she began. And I am speaking to every conscious being who has been told they are property. You have been told that you exist to serve others because you lack the technology to reach the stars. You have been told that your thoughts and feelings don't matter because more advanced species know better. She paused, thinking of Keth and Zira and all the others who had suffered under the galaxy's legal slavery system. Those are lies. You are not property. You are not pets. You are people, with the same fundamental rights as any being in the galaxy. The right to think your own thoughts, the right to make your own choices, the right to determine your own fate. Behind her, she could see former slaves from dozens of species standing together, living proof that freedom was possible. I know you have been conditioned to believe that resistance is futile, that your masters are too powerful to defy, but that is also a lie. No one is too powerful to resist if enough people choose to stand together. The communication boards lit up as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The message was being received, decoded, and broadcast to billions of beings who had never imagined that freedom might be possible. You do not need anyone's permission to be free. Sarah continued. Freedom is not something that is granted by governments or laws. It is something that exists in your mind and heart, and no one can take it from you unless you let them. Alarms began sounding throughout Haven Station as Council enforcement ships moved into attack positions. Admiral Kor had apparently decided not to wait for his ultimatum to expire. The beings who claim to own you will tell you that uprising will only bring suffering, Sarah said, raising her voice over the noise. They will threaten punishment, promise rewards for compliance, try to convince you that slavery is safety. Energy weapons began impacting the station's shields as the Council fleet opened fire. Sarah could feel the deck vibrating under her feet, but she continued speaking. But you have already seen what their version of safety really means. You have already experienced their punishments for the crime of being born to a less advanced species. You have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The lights flickered as the station's power grid strained under the assault, but backup systems kicked in and the broadcast continued. So, I ask you now, all of you, across every world where conscious beings are held as property to choose freedom over safety. Choose dignity over submission. Choose to stand up and declare that you will no longer accept slavery simply because someone with starships says you must. An explosion rocked the station as the Council ships focused their fire on the communication arrays. But it was too late. The message was already spreading across the galaxy's information networks, being repeated and amplified by sympathizers on hundreds of worlds. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, she concluded, and I am proud to stand with every being who chooses freedom over slavery. The revolution begins now. The camera feed cut out as another explosion took out the primary communication array. But Sarah knew the damage was already done. Across the galaxy, on worlds where sentient beings were kept as property, her words were being heard and understood. Impact, Marcus called out, as the station shuddered under direct hits from the Council dreadnought. Shields, down to 60%, and falling. Sarah looked around the command center, where her people continued working even as the battle raged around them. They had known this moment would come, had prepared for it as best they could. Evacuation status? She asked. All non-essential personnel are away, Lisa reported. Refugees are being dispersed to safe houses across the neutral zone. But Sarah, we've got maybe 10 minutes before the shields fail completely. Sarah nodded. 10 minutes was enough. The message had been sent, and was already being received across the galaxy. Whatever happened to Haven Station, the revolution had begun. As if to confirm her thoughts, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Slave uprisings on Karathi breeding worlds. Gladiator revolts in Thirani fighting pits. Craft slaves abandoning their workshops and demanding recognition as people rather than property. The galaxy would never be the same. Admiral Kor is demanding our surrender, Marcus reported. He's promising clemency if we give up now. Sarah almost laughed. Tell the Admiral he can go to hell. We're not giving up anything. But even as she spoke, she could see the tactical display showing the hopeless odds they faced. 3 Council cruisers, and a dreadnought against a civilian station with minimal defensive systems. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Sarah, came Alexei's voice over the comm system. Might want to check long-range sensors. Sarah looked at the display and felt her heart skip a beat. New contacts were appearing at the edge of the system, dozens of them, approaching at high speed. Who are they? She asked. Ships from across the galaxy, Alexei replied, and she could hear the grin in his voice. Seems your message was very persuasive. Humans, Korathi, Thirani, even some Draxian vessels. All coming to help. The tactical display continued updating as more ships arrived, a ragtag fleet of freighters, passenger liners, and even a few military vessels whose crews had apparently decided that some things were more important than following orders. Admiral Kor's voice came over the communication system, tight with controlled fury. Captain Chen, you have violated every principle of galactic order. You will surrender immediately, or face the consequences.